Grassroots family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. My colleague Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Research. Typically, you see me do interviews. You see Lawrence talk to the esteemed Rasheen to talk about a variety of issues. Today, we figure, Lawrence and I have been doing work for a long time, and there are conversations we have in the office that we think will be good for our viewers to listen to. And Afro-pessimism is one of those issues that we talked about for a while. So, Lawrence, in terms of getting the conversation started, as I just mentioned, you and I have been dealing with Afro-pessimism as a lens of analysis, as an idea for a real long time. Mm-hmm. And one of the things of reading this Jacobin article, which was written June 13, 2022, written by Jose Sanchez. To me, clearly, this person who wrote this article either just doesn't comprehend Afro-pessimism or just doesn't actually read the material. So how about this? Let's start with just give us a rundown as you would explain it, like what Afro-pessimism is, like some of the major tenets for someone really trying to understand what it is.
Yeah, so Afro-pessimism is a lens of analysis to understand how anti-blackness functions globally and historically throughout time. And it's really about how those who have power, those who create systems in the world, how they interpret blackness. It's not about how black people are meant to think about themselves. So Afro-pessimism uses terms like the slave as a conceptual frame of thinking. That's not to say that black people are slaves, that we have nothing, that we're down bad. That's just to say that the world systems don't interpret black people through the lens of humanity with the full set of rights and human capacities that are typically ascribed that term. So just, one example is how if you actually viewed black people as human, then the entire American legal system would fall apart, right? So think about just basic claims to bodily autonomy, claims to the labor of your children, the labor of your own body. Then obviously we'd have to pay massive reparations to black people all over the country, and the country would fall apart because all the work that we've done to improve the land, to improve the soil, to improve the conditions, that would all have to be reversed. So that's basically the Afro-pessimist argument that the recognition of black people as human is the end of the world. That's not like a nuclear bomb exploding all of modernity. That just says that the way the systems are built, the assumption of black people's humanity is so baked in to the legal system, to our visions of reform, to our visions of progress, that fundamentally challenging the inexorable march of those systems by demanding black people be seen as human, throws those systems into chaos. And that is something that should be seen as a moral guidepost to understand how we should relate to these systems as a lens of analysis. It is not an interpretive lens that gives prescriptive political prescriptions. It is not saying that we need to never engage in reform because all reform feeds the system, so we just do nothing. That is not the prescription of Afro-pessimism. It is a lens of analysis to understand how some of these systems historically of anti-blackness operate in the world so that people can be aware of these dynamics as they go about doing work. And that's kind of how we've used it here at LBS.
Yeah. All right, so one of the things that I think is uniquely important, one thing we've talked about in terms of Afro-pessimism is the importance of incognito, right? And Wilderson grounds the theory of Afro-pessimism in the work that he did in South Africa, which I think actually is one of them, and something you really put me onto. That's something that I think is a missing feature. I think most people deal with Afro-pessimism from the perspective of the high theory, right? And just kind of the theoretical aspects of it, as opposed to the recognition of it being grounded in the struggle in South Africa. So could you say a little bit more about how you connect the dots between what Wilderson does in Incognito and describing the fight within the ANC, and then how Afro-pessimism is a natural extension of that?
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, Wilderson is an American, but he actually travels to South Africa in the 80s. Mandela is freed, but the ANC has not taken power yet. So there's a power struggle between the Mandela loyal factions of the ANC that want a more, for lack of a better word, flag and anthem independence, taking over essentially the systems of the South African state. And Chris Hani, in some ways Winnie Mandela affiliated wing of the ANC, that want a more complete, total revolution Now, part of that obviously is a redistribution of land, the influence of Marxism, but also just black political control of new institutions that are designed to meet people's needs. And the idea of, first of all, the Marxists in South Africa fundamentally not supporting these more radical claims, basically being a force to try to rein in black people's demand for total freedom. Again, these are very real material stakes. So when people say Afro-pessimism doesn't engage the question of class, it's incredible because it's one of the very few people who's had on-the-ground experience with an actual Marxist party. And they're seeing their attempts to put the brakes on these more radical reforms in real time, in real life, in the 90s, within our lifetime. But I think that the academy can't deal with that. It can't deal with actually having these theories that they use put to test and failing. So they have to ignore it. And one thing that sticks out for me is that when Wilderson does his interviews, I think he does his best work in interviews, especially when he knows he's talking to black people. And that's stuff I know most of the academics have not seen. But, he goes on the radio a lot. He does YouTube videos where he's speaking to a black audience. And I think that's where my vernacular understanding of Afro-pessimism comes from, not from the academic articles alone. Right. Even though I don't think they read those either. You know what I mean? But he talks about after Hani is assassinated.
Chris Hani being the leader of the Communist Party.
Yeah, the leader of the Communist Party, is assassinated. Mandela and his folks take over. And Wilderson talks about a moment in South Africa where the vestiges of the apartheid security state actually team up with Mandela's people who are now being integrated into the security state. And they're both hunting Hani's people. So the idea of reform as a fundamental technology of anti-black violence, he's living it through the experiences of people he knows that he has a relationship with as, a research and technical advisor to not just the ANC, but the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. So he's actually seeing people he knows being targeted by not just the remnants of the white security state, but Mandela's people. Right. So having that visceral experience of this vaunted, revolutionary Mandela is still held up as the epitome of what a political statesman should be, the possibility of, political progress. And to see that literally lead to the persecution, the violent persecution of his friends, I think created an interpretive lens where it was like, what's happening here? And so, again, the people who critics say that he's a nationalist, like, that is a fundamental critique, and we're going to get to it, but that's a fundamental critique of the idea that just having black people in power is itself sufficient because it leads to the Hani wing of the ANC being violently hunted by, security forces who they were fighting with just, years before. Exactly. And he's trying to figure out, like, what's happening here. And when he's trying to build a historical political theory to explain that. But then he comes out and says, it's like, I'm burnt out. I'm just going to tell you what I saw. I don't know what to do with it. And I think it's an incredibly humility on his part saying that. So I don't understand why people are saying he's making political prescriptions, but he's incredibly adamant that that's not what he's doing.
Exactly. And so, because, and we're not shy about the fact that, like, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, our organization draws explicitly from, like, a Pan-African nationalist, black nationalist perspective. And as you and I have talked about before, this is caricature of black nationalism that we talk about a lot, where, kind of simplistic, narrow nationalism that doesn't consider, class and imperialism and hetero-patriarchal, all these other things. And when we look historically, so that's why I think Chris Hani is particularly important, because he's talking about, like, actual sovereignty of people of African descent in South Africa. And so people like Mandela, for those of us that are Pan-African nationalists, we are clear. And in Incognegro, Wilderson, there's a scene where he's in a room, talking to people, criticizing Mandela, and people get mad about it, right? But those of us that are Pan-African nationalists are clear that Mandela, very similar to the way that Barack Obama operates in the United States, is really a counter-revolutionary force, right? And so for me, a part of the utility of looking at, Afro-pessimism and using Wilderson's work is helping to sharpen our ability to really engage in material struggle for the masses of black people in a way that I think, and to the point you made earlier, I think some of the exponents of Afro-pessimism overextend Wilderson's analysis beyond it just being a lens of analysis, right? To me, it's not a prescriptive political project. It's to help us navigate, the kind of mature reality that we're faced with. And one of the things that, when I think about the fundamental piece in this Jacobin piece that is misunderstood is this thing about ending the world. And I think that's the thing that's really misunderstood, because the way that Jose Sanchez in this article describes Afro-pessimism is there's nothing we can ever do, and see, to me, what that misses is Wilderson is talking about the reality that the United States, that the West is a settler colony. And that if we understand that we live in a society organized on white supremacy, which is part and parcel of the project of European colonization and European domination of the world, and we understand that the history of how that emerged, the fundamental. Now, Wilderson doesn't describe it this way, and this may be why people criticize this. Wilderson is talking about the fact that a part of the rise of the project of European domination of the world, you talk about the European Renaissance, required the denigration of the humanity of people in African descent in every field of human endeavor. So whether it's Hegel saying that no history happened in Africa, whether it's, Marx who characterized, primitive African sharing societies, you have all these, European philosophers that was the foundation, the architecture of European domination, fundamentally needed to erase African history off the map to produce the current world, the current kind of ideological, psycho-existential plane that we're operating off of. So when Wilderson talks about ending the world, what you and I know is Black people as a people can't practice freedom unless this settler colony is destroyed. And I think, like you said, we're not saying there needs to be this, bombing of the United States or literal. We're talking about the thing that existentially holds the United States together is the fundamental anti-African underpinnings of Western civilization. And when people of African descent practice freedom, that's a fundamental disruption of the larger society. And so I think as a Pan-African nationalist, that is a helpful analysis, because it would seem to me that without addressing settler colonialism, then the thought must be keep society intact, but just redistribute the resources better, right? And as a Pan-African nationalist, I know that doesn't give Black people sovereignty and freedom, right? That just renders us. So let's talk about for a second. So one of the things that Jose Sanchez does, he makes what I think is a very weak analogizing between the logic of Afro-pessimism and Zionism. So how would you respond to the way that Sanchez tries to make this link between Afro-pessimism and Zionism?
So the way I read Sanchez's argument, again, it's very long and it's kind of convoluted. It's that the idea that if you assert that Blackness is a unique state because of the unique experience of the Middle Passage, which Wilderson does assert, he basically says that leads to racial essentialism. That means that there's something very you can't have an analogy between Blackness and other people's forms of oppression, which I think Afro-pessimism does state that. But then Sanchez makes the criticism of sort of blanket solidarity with all peoples and all forms of struggle. Afro-pessimism criticizes that because it says that the ways in which, other people are interpreting their view of liberation may not feed Black liberation, in some ways may be used as a tool against us, So being critical of solidarity is being read by Sanchez and others as no solidarity ever. We just need to have our own stuff, worry about our own issues, and don't nobody else matter. Which they argue is the exact same logic of Zionism, which is, the Jewish people are unique, we need our own state, blah, 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 right? And we were talking about this the other day, is that I really think it disproves Afro-pessimism's argument. Because part of Afro-pessimism's argument is that, the unique experiences of Black people tend not to register within civil society. It's not that we don't have our own culture, our own social life that we have with each other. It's that when they look onto us, they project themselves onto us. So all of the liberatory, complex realities of Black self-determination, Black Pan-African nationalism, that gets interpreted within the dominant discourse as, oh, it's the same as Zionism. So we become a living embodiment of the worst of the Eurocentric tradition, because there's no conception that maybe we have our own views of sovereignty. Maybe we have our own technologies of nation management and nation development that are not inherently exclusive in a violent capacity, but simply seeking to cultivate our own unique characteristics and then be able to engage other people contextually. But they just, again, it's just kind of this projection of the Black boogeyman.
Exactly.
And again, maybe there are a few extremely vocal, but very, very few people on Twitter who call themselves Afro-pessimist, who maybe they talk badly about other people who pursue interracial coalitions. And those people on Twitter get projected as the real Afro-pessimism that then serves the straw man argument that pieces like this can caricature as, akin to Zionism.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think a part of the challenge with the caricature of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism is the notion that that people of African descent who espouse or who operate from that framework aren't also thinking about other forms of oppression and domination. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, there was I don't know when it happened. There was a panel. I believe Dr. Spivak was on the panel with Angela Davis, and one of the things she criticizes Afro-pessimism, characterizing it as Black nationalism, talking about how they had to fight against Black nationalism in the past.
What people often don't realize also is that in Ferguson there were Palestinian Americans who were protesting. Many people think of the Black Lives Matter movement as a movement of only Black people, and that only Black people were out protesting the killing of Mike Brown in 2014. But there were Palestinians, there were Latinos, there were Asian Americans. It was a multi, what you might call multiracial. Although when I use that term, it's kind of bothersome to me. But I want to use this opportunity to say something about the way in which anti-blackness has traveled. And I'm not sure whether here in Germany you use the term anti-blackness. And I know that there is work that it does, but I'm very careful about the implications in this category, anti-blackness, implications that somehow Black people constitute the most important group subject to racism, and that now anti-blackness is used as a way to be deeply critical of people of color. So it's you've heard the term people of color, anti-blackness in people of color communities. And of course, there's racism. There's racism everywhere. Black people are subject to racism and have not been immune to the ideological assaults on other people of color. So I am really careful about assumptions that somehow Black people are the primary. They're the primary victims. There's a lot of discussion about pain and injury, which of course are very important, but I think that sometimes it serves as a barrier to developing solidarity, to developing the kind of hyper-empathy that we were talking about. And if from where I stand, the importance of Black people in the Americas resides precisely in the fact that there has been an ongoing freedom struggle for centuries and centuries. And this is more about freedom than it is about blackness, because there are also black people who are participating in the oppressive apparatus. And I don't want to forget that.
I have just a question. What do you think about Afro-pessimism? I really want you to say something.
This was my way of speaking about Afro-pessimism.
That's what I thought. Good. Okay, I got a good mark. That's what I thought. Good. Good. Yeah, I'm with you 100%.
Yeah, in many places in Europe, I've noticed that these ideas are traveling so rapidly.
Started in France.
And yeah, in France, in the Netherlands. And I think it's linked to a kind of black nationalism that that always appears to be that to which black movements defer. There's a kind of capitulation in front of black nationalism. It keeps coming back. I mean, we struggled against it in the 60s, but it just keeps coming back. Whenever we speak about black movements, somehow their nationalism is contours, and that's another problem I have with the nation state. And nationalism, the way in which it does its ideological work through those of us who think that we are contesting the state.
Yes, it's an object of resistance, Angela. I mean, that's why I said medicine and poison. Unless you constantly train, you got to be a Gramscian permanent persuader in order to use that bloody structure. But no, it's capable of great harm. But I just don't think, to my Mexican sister, that the state has to be like that. Those of us who are working on the subaltern sections of the electorate, the state, I mean, you will say no, and you will say no. As I say, I'm not shutting anyone, and you folks are my allies. But nonetheless...
We're also friends, Gayatri.
No,
just allies.
No, friends are different. We are friends on many issues, not just the bloody state.
And again, one of the frustrating things is that with black nationalism, it's like the worst versions are the things that get held up as that's what black nationalism is. But when you think about like a lot of the grassroots activity of black people, whether it's the Maroon Wars in Jamaica, whether it's the Haitian Revolution, whether it's, a lot of the, the Negro Convention movement of the 1840s, mid-19th century, even the work that I talk a lot about in terms of black Baltimore political and civic history, where you had like black institutions organized from the basis of black people's strength. Those are things that for me also are just as much Pan-Africanism and black nationalism as some of the more extreme versions that, people lift up, as mainstream. And it's kind of frustrating because to me, what that does is that it renders invisible what I believe are the anxieties that non-black people, particularly progressive and liberal whites, have about the notion of black people practicing sovereignty and self-determination. Because one of the things that Afro-pessimism really helped me to be clearer about is that there's a way in which black people politically and existentially are taken advantage of, right? That there is a dependence that is often imposed on black people, that we have to be dependent on these larger coalitions in such a way that questions of our sovereignty are villainized, right? So just merely wanting to come to the table from a position of strength is articulated as some kind of negative drive for power and chauvinism and whatnot, which to me is a pretty natural phenomenon, right? If you're talking about Palestinians and Palestinian liberation, I mean, most of the left, the understanding is they should have self-determination, right? But there's something about when black people do it that raises these anxieties, which I think Afro-pessimism is particularly useful in helping to explain.
Yeah, and I think that one of the tools of Afro-pessimism is it's not just political economy, which is interpreted by its critics to say it's not political economy at all. It's to say, yes, material political economy and libidinal economy. Libidinal economy is just a $5 word for like the psychological, social, and cultural ways in which blackness as a concept registers within people's minds. Right, so when Wilderson talks about like this idea of negrophilia, like there's this constant desire, like, you know, the mammy and like the congenial, affirming black ally. That's an emotional desire for people to feel like black people are affirming them, which has real material political implications. So the idea that a black person can not affirm you, cannot want to join your coalition, produces incredible anxiety amongst some people, in part because it's like, no, we need the multiracial coalition. But that's not just about pragmatic material politics. That's also something emotional about if this black person doesn't like me, what are they going to do? Are they going to lead a violent revolution against me? Are they going to, you know, undermine me and my work? And so this idea, this obsession with black people's acquiescence to multiracial coalitions isn't just, I really want the proletariat to succeed. It's some anxiety emotionally about the concept of black people having sovereignty. It's like a black box. Like, I don't know what they're thinking, which is like, exactly, that's what Afro-pessimism says. Right. The idea of the black body having sovereignty is so far outside of the void, you have to project onto it, you know, whatever the most negative caricature you can project from what you would do in that environment, what you're projecting onto black people.
Right. And I think, so and just on the class point in particular, because that's one of the things about this Jacobin article that to me is just so nonsensical, this notion that Afro-pessimism precludes the possibility of considering class when, and you know, he kind of obsesses on the use of the word slave, which I can understand, you know, again, as a Pan-Africanist, why I may not like the use of the term or the deployment of the term. But in terms of the concept, a realistic understanding of the structural positionality of people of African descent in this context is similar, like in Worse Than Trump, and then When Baltimore Awakes, I write about the fact that America is structured as a plantation, in many ways borrowing from the analysis of Afro-pessimism. And I use Hubert Henry Harrison and Negro in the Nation to talk about the shift that Civil War, the plantation, chattel slavery was enforced by brute force, and then after enslavement, it was wage slavery enforced by starvation. And so recognizing that this society is structured as a plantation, which is really the original way that the political economy is structured. So a black person who is operationalizing oppression against black people, those black gatekeepers, the black misleadership class, they are people for whom their ability to be that misleadership class is their proximity to the owners of the plantation economy of the United States. So to your point, Afro-pessimism doesn't preclude political economy, but I think helps us better understand that Afro-pessimism, to the point you made earlier about Wilderson's experience in South Africa, Afro-pessimism is an argument against Mandela. It's an argument against Obama.
Yeah.
Right? In ways that some of the folks who, you know, the kind of ideological bent of the Jacobin, I think misunderstands because of the lack of an analysis about colonialism and the true position that black people occupy in this society.
Yeah, I mean, he has a whole critique of Thabo Mbeki, who is empowered to do the economic negotiations as South Africa transitions to its independent state, and he just totally imbibes the neoliberal Kool-Aid. So, like, Wilderson is a critique of that just from his own perspective, but they don't have any space to talk about that because that challenges the misconceptions that are projected onto Afro-pessimism. Right. And yeah, I think that the idea of, again, we might want to say enslaved people as opposed to slaves, but the whole idea is like, it's not about them caring about us. Like, I just think it's a Michael Jackson argument. All I want to say is that they don't really care about us.
Right.
Like, that's Afro-pessimism to me.
Exactly.
So, Civil War, slavery, North didn't care about us. North had incredible anxieties around wanting to have Native American lands to colonize, and they were afraid of slavery pushing further west. That big reason they wanted to get rid of slavery wasn't liberating us. It was preventing the slave trade from stealing the land they wanted to own themselves. Similarly, the idea of we can't have proletariat, we can't have a proletariat if we have free labor undermining the wages of the actual proletariat. So it wasn't about creating a multiracial coalition of proletariats. It was securing the white proletariat from competition from free labor.
And of course, the threat of rebellions of enslaved Africans.
Of course.
Which made it in the interest of the North. In addition, what you just said made it in the interest of the North to pretend that they cared about slavery to abolish it for their own desire.
Exactly. And again, for me, Afro-pessimism is a heuristic where it's like, I don't think the Civil War was really about them caring about us.
Right.
And that impulse drives me to read more about the Civil War and interpret, okay, what was really going on.
Right.
And that political understanding is useful, right? But again, it's like, if you really need to believe that it was this multiracial coalition of abolitionists that was a nation-healing, nation-affirming act of liberating the slaves, which was the Civil War. Like, America tries to sell itself. It's like the Civil War is the reason we're a good country. Like, at best, you got back to neutral, which you didn't do because you would have needed to give us reparations to do that.
Right.
But why do we need to think that? Why do we need these mythologies of racial reconciliation? What psychological balm does that do for our politics, for our reality? That's where I think the libidinal economy argument of Afro-pessimism is useful.
Exactly. So there are two reasons for me in terms of the actual political work we do, that as to why Afro-pessimism has been particularly helpful. And we talked a little bit about both. The first is that an accurate understanding of the political economy of multiracial coalitions requires some investigation. What I see when people talk about multiracial coalitions, when you think about the people who fund the organizations that do multiracial coalitions, the people that actually have control of the resources or the institutional machinery that is the container for these multiracial coalitions, Black people typically are sitting at someone else's table with other people of other races calling it multiracial. And one of the things, like using Afro-pessimism as a lens, we talk a lot about the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that philanthropy attempts to curate which Black voices are in the front. And a lot of times, these are Black people for whom it is not from a position of power and sovereignty that they sit at these tables. But sitting at these multiracial coalitions gives them access to grants, gives them access to resources, gives them access to a sympathetic white left that, to your point earlier, feels better libidinally to have Black people as a part of their coalitions. And so a function a lot of those coalitions, and if people are honest, the Black people who are a lot of times in those contexts, if they're being honest, are clear that the multiracial coalitions argument in many ways serves as access to an audience and to resources that then takes us away from, building from a position of sovereignty. And one of the things that's interesting about like our political experience, like LBS in our work engages in coalitions, right, that are multiracial. We've worked with, Casa de Maryland, an immigration advocacy organization here in Maryland. We've partnered with Jews United for Justice on many issues. And so, we've engaged in, these multiracial coalitions. But what's beautiful about what we're able to do is we're able to do it from a position of strength. Like, we don't need them to like us, but we understand our mutual interest. And it's allow us to be effective in those multiracial coalitions. But one only gets there, I think, through an analysis that Afro-pessimism helps us to get to.
Yeah. Sometimes I think of it like interest convergence and critical race theory, i.e. Derek Bell, is the what. Like, what has been the mechanism and some of the dynamics of Black politics in America? Afro-pessimism helps figure out the why a little bit in terms of people's libidinal interests and also material interest in securing their own vision of the world, their own vision of themselves. And yeah, it's like Afro-pessimism does not give you a how off of that. That's what people like us to come up with.
Exactly.
Right? And I think because people aren't exposed to people like us in praxis, they assume that there is no how. And that Afro-pessimism is cool with there is no how. Versus Wilderson, I think he would say, I'm just not the person to figure out the how. I've just gone through what I've gone through. I'm trying to eat. I'm trying to survive in the academy. And that's what it is. Right?
Yeah, and I respect that because I think that's something that I think, and you and I have talked a lot about. What passes as the left is a lot of conversation and condemnation of folks and shitting on people on Twitter and on social media. But in terms of actually engaging in political struggle and producing political consequences, I think a lot of that is absent from what is called the left today. And we'll get, later on, we'll talk about examples of that. So one other thing on this multiracial coalitions piece, because again, I think, and in this Jacobin article, he describes it, or this person describes it as, Black exceptionalism, which to me is frustrating because it's really a misreading of history, right? In the sense that, as I mentioned before, like when we talk about, people of African descent having to be reliant on the intellectual vernacular, cultural resources of Europe and its political projects. And some people reduce that to just like an academic matter. But see, to me, there are real consequences of that, because a part of what I observe is that when we look around and we look for what are examples of Black political activity that is truly based on the notion that Black people can be the solution to our own problems, that if we build a base amongst Black civic life, which is diverse and has a bunch of things to navigate, but if we build a base and that be the basis of our political activity and recognize the uniqueness of our experience, that somehow that inherently is a negation to working with other people or recognizing the interest we have in working with others. And one of the things I want to drill down on is the fact that, one of the things that, I mentioned the nonprofit industrial complex earlier. And, a lot of the ways in which Black people are positioned when we talk about, whether it's social programs or whether we talk about, just issues facing Black people, oftentimes Black people are characterized primarily in terms of victimhood and oppression. And it's interesting because this article claims that Afro-pessimism does that. And to the point you just made, Wilderson is making the argument that looking at the society as it's structured. But the point that for us, it's like Black people can only be free. The prerequisite is Black people's own sovereignty and self-determination. So a part of what that sovereignty threatens is Black people's dependence on these institutions. And I think a lot of times the notion of the problem of Black people being dependent on other folks has been co-opted by the right, and considered, not wanting to address the condition of Black people. But I think it is this, if we are going to be free, we have to not be dependent on these relationships in order to get access to those resources, in order to get access to being able to practice freedom. And I think Afro-pessimism helps us to be clear about that for Black people, us being rendered as in the structural positionality as a slave, we have to end the world in which that is the basis for how we exist in the world.
Yeah, and I can see people's confusion because, again, I think there are some people on Twitter who believe that if I politic my suffering, if I politic my grievance, then your recognition of my experience as a slave is itself redress for my condition of slavery. Nowhere do I think Afro-pessimism says that. I think it says the exact opposite. When you think about Hartman and empathic identification and the idea that you could even understand what it means to be a slave, it's challenged by Afro-pessimism because of the argument around the unique reality of Black peoples. It's not just a standpoint epistemology argument, which I think a lot of people reduce it to. It is a structural positionality argument. And it's not an argument outside of an analysis of, the work of African-centered theorists and things like that. I think, for example, I need to track it down, but when Wilderson challenges Giorgio Agamben and the relationship of bare life to slavery, one thing he says is that like the Ma'afa is not equivalent to the gas chamber. It's like you went in a Jew, you came out a Jew. They went in Africans that came out Black. They were separated from their homelands, their customs. Now, that separation is not total. And I think Afro-pessimism, in terms of a criticism from a Pan-African perspective, could be better at fleshing out some of the legacies and connections of the African experience to the Black experience. But as a political positionality, it's like we don't have treaties where we can say we own this land and use those treaties to like attack the system the way the Native Americans do, or like the people in the Caribbean do, or the people on the African continent do. It's a different structural position. It's not a standpoint epistemology argument only. And when he says Ma'afa, I believe he cites Marimba Ani. So he's read all that stuff. I think, respectfully, some folks have criticized him for like not reading Ani or Wilson. It's like, I know Wilderson is kind of an intellectual asshole, for lack of a better word. Like, I know he's read all that stuff because that's just who he is. He doesn't cite it. And I think he probably has his own reasons why he doesn't cite it. But I think it's probably because he just, he knows how the academy works. And he knows that if he starts citing that, it's going to be this whole big battle. And it's a whole thing. But I think that's a legitimate criticism.
Right.
That it'd be easier for us to make the argument we're making if he cited that stuff more. Because we could say there's a clear trajectory between the work of African-centered theorists and the conclusions of Afro-pessimism. But I know he does say on one of the podcasts he did that he doesn't do anything without consulting his Babalawo. So he clearly personally has that relationship.
And say what that is for people that don't know.
Yeah, Babalawo, Baba, father, like a spiritual father within the African-centered spiritual tradition. Right? So he personally has clearly stated that that's part of where he's coming from. Like his family's from Louisiana, right? But in his theory, he's citing Lacan. He's citing this Eurocentric theorist. But the conclusions he's trying to make are very much challenging the hegemony of only those Eurocentric theorists being able to interpret the experience of African people.
And so in some ways, recognizing the way that Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism is caricaturized, that public intellectual distance from that tradition, I think a lot of scholars make that calculation.
Yes.
Right? A lot of them have engaged in a lot of that stuff. But it goes to prove the argument we're making, that what brings together the folks for whom people intellectually try to have distance from is those who espouse, Pan-African nationalist perspectives. And that brings to the second reason as to why I think the conversation about Afro-pessimism is important for our work, is because we're clear that in this settler colony, there is no freedom for Black people as a people. And that any political activity should be moving towards establishing a new world. That's not going to happen overnight, but what that new world is, because Black people as a people aren't practicing sovereignty in kind of a major way anywhere on the globe. And that's something that should be alarming for us, that there's so much talk about, Black oppression. It's been mainstream now where people are talking about police brutality and other forms of structural racism. But people of African descent, like we don't have what I describe, and I'll write about eventually, the civilizational machinery to operate as a people independently. So that renders us to being, again, reliant, whether it's where we go to the store. Reminds me of the conversation that I had with Heber Brown from the Black Church Food Security Network. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? It's like if we don't even control what we eat and how it gets to us, we can't really be practicing freedom. And so a part of, again, what Afro-pessimism does and why it's important is it helps us to zero in on the fact that there is no version of this society in which Black people are free. And I think, again, the author of this Jacobin article and the people of that ideological bent are, however conscious, maybe even subconsciously, to Wilderson's point, if that notion freaks them out. Like it freaks them out. And it explains, again, why we don't see more Pan-African nationalist political formations in conversations that the left has.
If that's what it means to be a slave, like not controlling your material conditions, then like control your material political conditions. Like don't be a slave no more.
Right.
Like, but when they say Afro-pessimism precludes any possibility, I think they're almost snitching on themselves. It's like, you don't think that's possible. You think the only thing that's possible is us getting access to resources that white people choose to give us. So when Angela Davis says we need solidarity, I think part of her might be saying that. It's like the only resources we can get are the ones that we finesse out of these white institutions. And again, I think Afro-pessimism is, not alone, but one tool amongst many that says like, legacy of COINTELPRO, it's like the psychological damage creates this libidinal economy, this fear of Black sovereignty that we have to run towards as opposed to run away from. And if that's what running towards the end of the world is, then that's like a psychologically liberating possibility to pursue what would it look like to feed ourselves?
Right.
What would it look like? Because that is the end of the world. Like Black people feeding themselves means we're no longer subject to the violence of starvation. The world can't function without the violence of starvation for Black people. You know what I mean?
And one last point on this piece which is that, and we joke about this within our team, people believe in America. Like the writer of this Jacobin piece believes in America as redeemable. And one of the things about Wilderson's argument about, Afro-pessimism, we're crystal clear that America is not redeemable. So we don't seek recognition by white folks. We don't seek, try to finesse institutions into seeing our humanity and giving concessions. And for me, that's such an important point, important aspect of our advocacy. that we real clear. Like we don't need to be recognized, and we've made it a point that we built such a strong base that is primarily Black people, that we engage these larger institutions from a position of we're gonna make you do it. This is this is actual political warfare, and we engage from that perspective. But you have to get to a place where you're clear. Black people, we need to build the institutional wherewithal to advance our interests and protect ourselves from threats from externally. And that don't mean that we don't engage in coalitions. We should, but we should do it with that peace in mind. But again, if you still believe in America, then you fundamentally have a tacit belief in what I described as a more comfortable plantation for Black people, as opposed to, the Haitian Revolution, Nat Turner, creating a new world that would destroy the plantation.
Yeah, I mean, to somewhat be devil's advocate, because I'm thinking about the phrase, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you have the power to negotiate. I think these folks would claim to agree with that argument, but say the only power we can plug into is like the power of the white proletariat, because we need to strengthen numbers and the votes or whatever. Now, what we're saying is that we need power to be able to negotiate with them too.
Right. That's it.
Because we need to not be caught lacking in a world where they have the power to be able to determine these systems of control, and then we just become a tool of their control as opposed to a control of the power of the white bourgeoisie. You know what I mean? So, again, at a very basic guidepost, I think we can maybe transition a little bit into some of the
particular examples. That's exactly
some
what
of
I
the
was
examples.
Yep.
I think it's very important.
Yeah. So let's talk about police accountability stuff. So that's something we've been doing for a while, since around 2013 or so. And, one of the things that our public conversation around police accountability has been, too much of it is rooted in the notion of wanting people to recognize and empathize with the suffering of Black people killed by police, and that the images, that are highly circulated are a way toward that. And what I think that does is that then it frames the solutions that people come up with in a particular way. And so in this particular context, we heard a lot about, police training. We heard a lot about body cameras, things like use of force statutes to try to criminalize a certain level of force. And these are things that, while in some ways may be useful, what we've argued is that placing those things at the center misses the fundamental point. So as we just discussed, we're clear America is not redeemable. So we don't think that law enforcement as an institution is a redeemable institution. We have no faith that that's going to be the case. What we do know is that if you can impact an institution's livelihood or an individual's livelihood, that gives us the greatest institutional weapon against this institution's ability to harm Black people, and it's the greatest deterrent. So similar when we think about like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in October 1966, forming with the kind of immediate issue of police brutality. They armed themselves with guns, but also knew the law of the Second Amendment enough that they were able to curtail police brutality because there was a legitimate threat of force against law enforcement who abused Black people. And so similarly, we focused on community oversight, the ability for the community to fire police officers and do independent investigations in order for the community to be able to exercise power, a threat of power in a different way. But similarly, in terms of power against law enforcement who undermines the humanity of Black people. And this is a concept that over the years has been difficult for many of our progressive friends to rally around, because I think this piece, because for us, Afro-pessimism made it clear, if America is irredeemable, and people fundamentally don't see people of Africa as human beings, and that for them to see Black people as human beings would be the end of the world, then I know that any effort to try to get our humanity recognized is not the point, but to give Black people power. And I remember talking to a reporter about this, about the notion of giving Black people power over law enforcement to fire police officers. And I remember a reporter being offended by the thought. And part of what they were saying were like, wow, like, is the community qualified to do that?
Yeah.
Isn't that giving the community too much power? which to me, again, speaks to the point that Afro-pessimism makes, because the only way that that's a rational question is if there is a subconscious belief in people of African descent not being entitled to the full rights that human beings deserve.
Yeah, I mean, Wilderson appropriates Orlando Patterson, and he uses some language from him, like general dishonorment. Like, black people are generally dishonored in our society, so we don't believe that they have cultures and systems of their own production that can function. So when you talk about community firing police, if you're operating from a framework of general dishonorment, like, you're not assuming the community has any indigenous capacity to be rational, any indigenous capacity to, actually engage in material thoughtfully. You just think that it's emotional. And people are emotional because you're projecting those negative projections onto black people. I will say that they also have those negative perceptions of white people. So I think that that's also, again, quite interesting, especially like poor working class white folks. But again, it's like, I think that generally when you talk about power invested in black people's hands, it's beyond people's conceptual framework. It's beyond the edge of the world for them. It's off the map. So we have to do a lot of work, knowing, because of Afro-pessimism, explaining what it looks like, building the capacity, and be forceful in not budging on that being the metric by which we apply, because we know that's always going to be where they push back.
And this whole thing about, like, just the notion of black people having power. Like, one of the things we've seen across the state, like, one of the things that was a part of we worked on the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021. And of course, we didn't get the things that we wanted, in terms of what would be the pinnacle community oversight. But there are these police accountability boards that the legislature created, which would allow some non-police involvement in certain internal disciplinary aspects of law enforcement. And each jurisdiction, the 24 jurisdictions in Maryland, and each of them had to establish these police accountability boards. And without exception, in every jurisdiction, the anxieties around community folks serving on these police accountability boards with the ability to participate in discipline. In every example, in fact, in Prince George's County, which is a majority black jurisdiction in Maryland, and while Baltimore City occupies like number one in a lot of the sociological challenges that black people face, Prince George's County, even though it's wealthier, occupies number two in many contexts. And in Prince George's County, I went down to a few of their council meetings to just observe. And one of the things that was a key part of the challenge, the community wanted the county council, to be able to appoint members to the Police Accountability Board, because the community has more ability to influence a county council person than they do the county executive. And the struggle was the county executive wanted to essentially pick a majority of the board. And the Fraternal Order of Police, in a podcast they did last year, actually, and this is a black man who is statewide leadership in the FOP, claimed that they were confident in their ability to control the membership of the Police Accountability Board, and made it clear that that was a very important part of the work that they were to do, given the passage of the Maryland Police Accountability Act. And so that was a main fight that, unfortunately, the county executive in Prince George's County is going to have a majority, be able to pick majority of the members of the Police Accountability Board. So again, going back to the point you made, like, it's on the questions of giving black people power that there's the most political pushback. And again, this is across the entire state. In Baltimore City, we may see something different because we're here and we'll be able to, really push on that in ways. But I think that helps make the point. This point of giving black people power is something that fundamentally is offensive to a lot of political formations and the like. And I think Afro-pessimism really helps explain that.
If you actually listen to like his interviews, he talks a lot about acceding to the authority of black people on the move, like working class black people on the move. And the white left have not been so down with that. I mean, even the focus on Bernie. It's like Bernie is like an executive, one singular point of power. And a lot of the white progressives are like, that's a good idea. If we just had the executive in charge, then they could do it. They could do Medicare for all. They could appoint the right people. And the idea of like grassroots community power is seen as too chaotic. It's seen as not their vision of a progressive movement, wasn't as amenable to that structural reality, So So yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about Medicare for all?
Yeah, let's do that. Well, let me say one more thing about police accountability and go to that. Because I also think that in addition to the overwhelming pushback, one of the things about because a part of what we had to do in 2021 was repeal the Maryland Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And one of the things that is important to note is that it's structured as a labor agreement.
Yep.
Right? And it's one of those times when labor policy is used against black people. And it's one of those things that to me speaks to the limitations of the left, right? Because if we're looking at, well, what are the policies that are undermining black people's ability to practice power and self-determination? Well, this is a context where labor policy is being used against black people. But again, it's why Afro-pessimism is so important, because if you are reliant on a left orthodoxy that always suggests that, pro-labor measures are good, just universally good, then we miss the ways in which it can be used against black people. And this conversation around police unions and labor policy being used as a mechanism against black people having power over or community oversight is something that I know people know. Like, we've discussed it in a bunch of contexts. But the emphasis in the mainstream is consent decrees and stuff like that, as opposed to addressing this issue. And I would argue because of the fact that the very notion of black people being or not having full access to the rights of human beings is something that, because one lacks that analysis, it's almost like people can skip over that because of the left orthodoxy around not wanting to criticize labor
Briefly
policy.
on unions. Like, if you believe black people are outside of history and outside of humanity, then the union brings them into history and brings them into humanity. So all black people in unions is always better. So the idea that black people were brought into unions as a form of like quarantining them into like the crappiest, lowest wage jobs is unthinkable to you. The idea that like in Baltimore, they integrated the unions at the docks, and it messed up the black people's own internal seniority system. So they were actually begging to bring back the segregated unions, post-union integration. The idea that black construction workers will be more willing to work independently than join the union, even if they got paid higher wages in the union because they wanted their independence, which is exactly what happened in Baltimore. It's just so far beyond your conceptual framework that you end up supporting even folks like David Simon and his depictions of like the police union that's like fighting for their employees as a good thing, which Jacobin did, wrote a glowing piece about we own this city, in part because of like their portrayal of the labor union fighting for its workers, So yeah, it just kind of hamstrings you, because like you said, you should know better than to think that the police union as a union is good. But it's so emotional, and they want to think of it as so objective because they're the immortal science of Marxism or whatever. But the idea, because again, like I've seen it. I've seen black white folks get together and sing "Solidarity Forever," and how enthused they get when the black person starts singing it. Right? It's a deeply emotional, abysmal thing for them about, hey, this guy's joining into our movement. It makes me feel so affirmed. I mean, you have to just protect yourself from that. Predatory inclusion, or Wilderson calls it the battering ram effect, where they'll take the violence and the degraded condition of black folks and hold that up to push through whatever their political demand is, and then knock down the door for them and leave you on the outside.
So let's talk about Medicare for all, because I think this is an example of a policy that the left is, largely supportive of, and this is one of those places where I think it requires a lot of nuance to talk about effectively, because we've talked a lot, in our other work around the limitations of the progressive left. And, there are a lot of people who've been frustrated about the way that we talk about it. And in some cases have tried to characterize that critique as being on the wrong side in terms of the policy. So I think I'm, confident in saying that both of us generally support the policy of Medicare for all. And it is the case that it's a very popular policy demand. But there are elements of it as a central focal point of advocacy that is problematic, and that I think Afro-pessimism is helpful in illuminating. And so what I mean by that is, when we think about, again, we talked earlier about black people primarily being understood as victims as primarily being understood as recipients of services. So when you think about, working class people in general, and then black people in particular, the notion of Medicare for all is expanding service so that there are more recipients of these important services. Now, the challenge, though, is that it becomes a question of how do those services how are they actually rendered in our community? And one of the places the left just doesn't talk about or talks about poorly is the way in which some of these services, whether it's the medical industry, whether it's child welfare, whether it's the nonprofit sector, that they don't talk about the ways in which these institutions and how they operate actually can do harm to our community. And again, we've talked about that extensively, and I talk about it extensively in When Baltimore Awakes, where you have practitioners that are supposed to be helping to help folks who need services navigate the complexities of their circumstance and provide services. But a lot of times these services are provided from what we describe as disaster management, right? Merely giving people the sustenance they need, while usurping the importance of them becoming self-sufficient and empowered, both as individuals and as a community. And so it creates a context where black people then, our communities are reliant on the benevolence. In this context, we're talking about Medicare for all, benevolence of these medical institutions to provide services. And then when you think about the way that these services are provided, you think about the fact, for instance, there are studies that have done that said that particularly black men are understood to be more resistant to pain, and so are not given pain medicine. We look at the way in which particularly black women are disproportionately encouraged to have hysterectomies, right? We look at the way in which, again, many of the services that are provided in such a way that deliver, mere sustenance. There are also other approaches to health outside of the traditional medical model that actually are more empowering the community, more indigenous, more community or culturally informed, that would be more helpful to the community, but are marginalized because if those approaches to health or wellness are elevated, well, then it would be disruptive to those who are seen as thought leaders and experts in the field, again, undermining the ability for black people to be sovereign in our ability to deliver health and wellness to our own community. And I would argue the reason that you don't see many black grassroots formations really rallying around Medicare for all as a policy and it being espoused by black folks, that are present on the political scene is because black people on the ground's experience of the institutions that deliver these services has been problematic. And I don't ever see that addressed by progressives. And a part of what so there's one perspective that's emerging where folks are saying white progressives have now moved to the left of black people, right? And so there's this conversation around, well, part of the challenge is because black people now occupy a place that is more politically conservative. I think it's an attempt to unduly or to misunderstand the dynamic of why that's the case. So part of what I mean then in looking at Medicare for all and its limitations as a political organizing tool for black people is to say that if black people don't have sovereignty over the institutions providing them health and wellness, then expanding Medicare for all in some ways may provide some people with more disaster management services, right? More sustenance. But in fact, can be disempowering of black people because it's expanding these institutions' ability to essentially have power and dominion over, over black people. And then we look at, we talking about Baltimore. Let's give Baltimore the context. We're looking at institutions like Johns Hopkins and University of Maryland School of Social Work, or University of Maryland in general. These are institutions that I would say the average working class black people would say these institutions have a negative impact on the larger community in Baltimore, right? But Medicare for all puts those institutions in a position to be the savior of black people in the community. And so I'm saying all this to say that, and then tying in Afro-pessimism, if black people are not human beings, if we're normalizing the settler colony, then all Medicare for All is doing is distributing more resources that are already ineffectively delivered in a settler colony. And that as black people, that's not freedom. And I think there's an intuition amongst a lot of working class black people that, yeah, that's cool, but that's not freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. And two things directly related to what you said. It is beyond the perspective of most white people that, like, the service is actually violence. It's not imperfect. It's not that it's not good. It's that it's violence in and of itself. So again, when some black women go to the medical sphere and they get a diagnosis of a mental health condition, which through the logic of white liberalism is good because now they can get medication and services, but through the logic of black people, it's like, that's an extra strike in the Child Protective Services register to help you get your kids taken away. Mm-hmm. And they're even doing stuff like they take your kids away, make you go for a psych eval, determine that you're traumatized, which they then justify not giving you your kids back. Mm-hmm. 1 in 2, half of all black kids will have a CPS investigation on them. Mm-hmm. And the medical catchment area is a huge area of surveillance and disciplining of black people in that world. Even when you control for class, the racial dynamics are important because, again, natal alienation, general disarmament. We don't think black people care about their kids because of the legacies of slavery being projected onto them. White progressives don't have anything really to say about that. In fact, when they say defund the police, a lot of times they say fund the social workers who are taking away people's kids.
Exactly.
Right? And so similarly, last thing is that they genuinely cannot imagine that if we did nothing, black people would still do our own stuff, and you could just fund that instead.
Right.
So we have gardens. You know what's better than giving blood pressure medication? Giving good food upstream so you don't get sick and need the blood pressure medication. Mm-hmm. I support people having blood pressure medication. I'd rather have you give black people money to build their own gardens so less of us need it at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And if you put all the money downstream into the blood pressure medication and the surgery, where's the money going upstream for sovereign black attempts to do preventative care? Mm-hmm. Right? And to the extent that white liberals and progressives want to do that, we can have a coalition. Mm-hmm. But it's got to be us having our autonomy to do our stuff, and y'all have y'all autonomy to do y'all stuff. Mm-hmm. So if it's poor white people who want to have a garden, go at it. Mm-hmm. But we got to have our autonomy to do our stuff too. Mm-hmm. And the idea of scaling that up to actually be a healthcare service, I mean, I don't know, maybe they don't think it's possible. Maybe they don't think black people can do it, especially without them.
Right. And I think...
Because that's the logical conclusion.
Right.
Like, that's what you should do.
Right.
And in fact, even Bernie, he gave some money to clinics, but, like, you should go all the way upstream and focus on independent black sovereign stuff that just magnify that, you know, so we don't have to get onto this whole Medicare debacle because it's still the medical for-profit Medicare. Mm-hmm. It's just the government paying for it, as opposed to the insurance companies.
Right. And so I think, and that piece right there about us being able to do it in a way where we don't need them. And it goes back to what you talked about before about the need, you know, Fanon even talks about this where, you know, black people as an insurance policy on their humanity, like wanting black people and getting enjoyment from our participation in their, you know, social context, which in many cases, in the context of this conversation, in their political context, without relinquishing the structural power dynamic that allows them to drive the nature of how the solutions are developed. And so, you know, because for instance, one of the things that, again, I don't see progressives or the Jacobin really go into is there are networks of black people to do health and wellness that should be at the forefront of any advocacy around black people's health. That, again, if we're made the focal point of the coalition, well, then we should have a coalition, right? And would make it so that Medicare for All could be a more popular policy demand that Indigenous black formations advocate for as a priority. But progressives don't even know enough because of the way in which they've internalized, you know, black people as not having autonomy, sovereignty, agency, that is something that is beyond their conceptual understanding, right? And I think that's such an again, talking about the way that Afro-pessimism is helpful, I've been in a variety of political contexts where when I discuss networks of black people providing these services in a way that's affirming and feeds our autonomy and self-determination, that like liberals and progressives just freeze.
Yeah.
Right? I remember having a conversation with someone who I consider a friend, a white person who I consider a friend, for whom, they said to me, they said, Dayvon, I just feel like the way that you describe black liberation, I don't see myself in it. And what I said back to them was, I don't want you to. Mm-hmm. I want to imagine a world where black people have our own world, and then our worlds can intersect sometimes. But to the extent that our worlds intersect, I want to maintain my sovereignty and not have to consider you in the world of me meeting the needs of myself and my community. And so going to in terms of the Medicare for All example, if there is a coalition that progressives really want, then they have to be willing to put that front and center. I think there are a lot of black people that know that that should be the case. But again, like we talked about earlier, because of the financial and social benefits of capitulating to a coalition that does not put that on the forefront, becomes an incentive for people not to heed it. You know what I mean? So the last thing on this Medicare for All piece, and then just kind of tying into the Wilderson piece, because I think the way that I would want people to really think about the conversation we just had, is the way in which Afro-pessimism is misunderstood, and the way that we actually use it in political struggle. We talked about police accountability, and wanting people to really, particularly the left, to recognize that as people who are engaged in political activity, one of the things that we worked on and we continue to work on is cannabis legalization here in the state of Maryland. And we were able to establish a community repair and reinvestment fund where not less than 30% of the tax revenues are coming directly back to the communities impacted by the war on drugs. The work that we've done on the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund, and having 3% of the city's property tax dollars go directly back to majority black-led grassroots organizations. The work we've done in helping to establish the Black Arts and Entertainment District and getting more access to resources for black creatives and whatnot. So we're engaged in political material struggle that in which Afro-pessimism has been helpful for us navigating these material realities and producing like political outcomes that are good for the masses of black people, right? Not our politics isn't one where bourgeois black people are the biggest beneficiaries, but our work has decidedly been, I can name other examples of work that we've done, but have decidedly been beneficial to working class black people.
Yeah.
And for me, that's one of the biggest takeaways. That's, again, mentioning this Jacobin article that talks a lot about wanting to advocate for the working class and saying that Afro-pessimism does not. For me, I want the folks listening to this to be clear that as Pan-African nationalists who use Afro-pessimism as a helpful lens of analysis among many other intellectual tools, if you really want to be engaged in material struggle and actually produce outcomes, what we have understood is, and there are other folks in Baltimore who are doing the work from this perspective, from this approach of understanding points of sovereignty. I already mentioned Heber Brown and the Black Church Food Security Network. We had Nika Dondi from Fight Blight. Folks from the Bloom Collective that do maternal health. Collectively that tries to provide more resources to grassroots organizations and building an ecosystem of a positive vision of what black people are and what we can do. So there are lots of folks in our sphere, in our network, that use this perspective to actually engage in work that materially benefits black people. And that's something that I really want to drive home, because pieces like this are encouraging black people to subject ourselves, in my opinion, to relationships to the larger political landscape based on relying on people's benevolence and dependence on other people's political machinery. So I want to drive that home. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, so I think that Afro-pessimism, similar to a lot of black folks throughout history, is a attempt to jar you by challenging you to really rethink your basic assumptive logic about how you think things work. So whether you jump with Afro-pessimism or not, I think the point you just made is really important, is that many of the attacks on Afro-pessimism are things you should pay attention to, because this is an attempt to just continue to force people into the assumptive logic that the only thing that works is interracial coalitions, where you're asking for, you know, some interest convergence with someone else's machinery and someone else's political thought system, someone else's political reality. And yeah, I think that there are just really good examples of needing to have a system. And again, I don't think people see it as a system. They see it as just people talking wild. It's a system of analysis, a heuristic, a lens by which you can interpret what's going on around you to help you come to certain political conclusions because you understand how the machinery works. Like, one thing I appreciated about Wilderson was that people were dismissing Trump. And yeah, I was looking at the polling data. I was dismissing Trump a little bit. And he was like, don't dismiss Trump. Because there's something libidinally refreshing about what he says that people won't admit to. So that's an actual interview, but he says that, you know, 3 months before the dude got elected. So that's the utility of some of this stuff that, again, maybe other people in the academy don't claim it that way, but the reality is that the reason I don't dismiss Afro-pessimism is I know working class black people that will give me Wilderson's entire argument having no idea who Frank Wilderson is. I hear from my cousins, I hear from my brother. They still want us to be slaves. They never wanted to free us. And no matter what we do, we still slaves to them. So if you actually hear black people on the move, on the ground, and you understand, assume they are rational in their political interpretations and not seduced by false consciousness and not seduced by the black leadership class or seduced by black hetero-patriarchal masculinity. Because a lot of women say this stuff too. You know, you can actually hear them and actually have theories that reflect that reality that you can then use to interpret the world around you and do stuff that makes sense.
All right. Well, that was our talk about Afro-pessimism. You know, of course, continue to check out our work. And that's it for this afternoon. Peace.